What happens when one of Britain's most cherished comedy greats walks onto The View expecting just another typical interview but finds instead a host bent on turning the conversation into a battle? It all started to go hilariously wrong. That's what happened when the legendary creator of both Mr. Bean and Blackadder sat down for what was supposed to be a run-of-the-mill interview. It all began just like any other visit by a beloved star aiming for a little publicity for his upcoming project. But by the time the show finished, what the audience had actually witnessed was a fascinating breakdown of a public meeting with a determined interviewer. We kick off this epic breakdown before the moment it all kicked off. So smash that subscribe button and let me know your thoughts about TV drama moments like this in the comments below. There, under the blazing studio lights, Rowan Atkinson sat on The View's infamous couch, ready for an interview where he'd be discussing his projects and a long career in comedy spanning many decades. He is always the thoughtful, controlled, and measured individual when talking to the public, which made what he came unprepared to find even worse. But he really could have done with seeing there would be some friction in store at the table with one of Britain's most popular stars. Directing Rowan's gaze was Joy Behar, and some eagle-eyed viewers would have recognized her expression. It's a special one that she reserves when she thinks an answer can be turned on its head or the conversation with a guest can become compelling entertainment for the millions of Americans tuning in. And that's when things got interesting. So Rowan said Joy in her iconic New York tones before cutting through the studio's hum. You have based a career in comedy around barely speaking. Mr. Bean hardly utters a sound, and in your days of Blackadder you're often the put-upon character. Are you not the case that you play characters with less to say because you've not much to say personally? That immediately threw everyone off the scent. This was less about comedy light relief and certainly less about celebrity puff pieces. You only had to see the slight glances between the other panelists to know things were turning into something unexpected. Atkinson simply did not let any annoyance show, though you might just have noticed his eye was perhaps twitching slightly with the impact of Joy's question. Well, Joy came his crisp British accent in response. There is a fine difference between choosing one's moments to speak and having nothing of value to add. I find physical comedy often speaks more profoundly than any amount of speech, but Joy would not be easily silenced or diverted and came at him a second time. Is that just a polite way of saying you hide behind characters because you are unwilling to expose who you really are? What is the last time any of us saw the true Rowan Atkinson outside of Mr. Bean or a bumbling historical figure? Even the studio audience was beginning to shift uncomfortably as this discussion moved from humor to a quite intense scrutiny of personality. None of us are that comfortable when a comedian's career is dissected by people with no relevant experience. Whoopi at the head of the table seemed particularly concerned and tried to caution Joy with a glance. Atkinson's jaw tightened as it grew more evident that his calm exterior would eventually crack. I think it's interesting that you consider deliberating before speaking to be the same as hiding, and believe me, I have noticed those who make the most noise the least well. He also found space to declare, my characters are not masks, they are investigations into human experience. Mr. Bean expresses a level of alienation and frustration that millions of us feel but simply cannot voice. I know that Rowan and don't tell us human experience that is just rubbish. You're happy to play around with a character who acts like a child because perhaps it's an easier subject than that of a grown adult, and the public is better off here in the States. Our comedians are prepared to stand up and tell it as it is. That seemed to take a knock, and for a fleeting moment, Atkinson's well-practiced, almost reptilian smile did creak, and he allowed his frustrations to emerge from behind the mask. But no one in the studio will soon forget his reply. I'm not aware that our nationality has anything to do with whether our art is good or bad. He eventually snapped back. But Joy wasn't done there. Atkinson's reaction, if anything, seemed to give her exactly the opening she had been waiting for. Nationalist talking points? She fired back, eyes suddenly flashing as if she had just found the angle to make this interview newsworthy. That's rich coming from someone whose career has been built on perpetuating the stereotype of the bumbling, hapless British idiot. So tell me, Rowan, how does it feel knowing that your most successful creation is effectively a middle-aged man with the cognitive function of a toddler? And is that something you are proud to teach kids? The temperature in the room changed immediately. The other hosts looked increasingly uncomfortable. Sarah Haynes tried to deftly maneuver the conversation to Atkinson's upcoming projects with an innocuous question, but Joy cut straight over her. Seriously, she continued, her voice rising in indignation. When a parent turns on Mr. Bean for their child, what does it say about the value of life, of responsibility, of anything, if they think that being incompetent and a total goofball is a perfectly acceptable life choice? Atkinson had remained still until now, hands placed at his sides of the arms of the chair, but now his fingers slowly tightened into fists. When he spoke again, his tone was steady, but there was a newfound conviction to it. Joy, I'm increasingly beginning to suspect that you have never actually experienced watching either Mr. Bean or Blackadder with a view to appreciating rather than judging what we do. Mr. Bean is not appealing because he is incompetent. He is appealing because he finds unconventional solutions to problems and perseveres when life unexpectedly comes off the tracks of routine, but the kids don't connect to him because he's an idiot. They connect because he sees life differently than they do. Problems? Joy laughed, and the sound was decidedly unpleasant. Feel how to how Finchru crosses without turning the whole exercise into a logistical nightmare. And the same goes for Blackadder. Whether he is cynical, whether he's foolish, whether he is trying to achieve impossible things, it all leads to disaster for him. We are essentially portrayed as utterly failed beings by English comedy. What's with that? Silence had fallen over the studio at this point. It wasn't just uncomfortable anymore, it felt as though everything had stopped the moment Atkinson began to talk, everyone in their seats, the crew holding their breath. Atkinson's usually controlled on-stage composure was starting to fray. Behind his affable television persona was an artist who over decades painstakingly developed his trade as an actor and writer, and he had just met a presenter who was gleefully misinterpreting his creations and dismissing the point behind them. Wound and darm. Wathine Sid carefully selecting his words as if assembling something that you equate failure with misery. Comedy, English comedy in particular, is about celebrating the times that it does not work, the moments in which the planning and plotting come to nothing, and you're faced with this "oh hell what do now" expression, and discover a resilience and a grace in that, rather than simply sighing and going home and eating ice cream. Joy, though, was emboldened. Grace? I fail to see any particular grace in a grown man destroying a large portion of an entire shopping center because he doesn't understand the mechanics of the changing room. And frankly, the black-garbed villains whom Atkinson portrays are so cruel and mean-spirited, surely nothing to laugh at there. In that moment, perhaps, without even realizing it, Joy actually got to the heart of the issue and completely missed the point. This wasn't an argument about comedy. It was an argument about the artistic ethos of a writer who had honed his craft for decades, and now some bright new thing was telling him it was worthless, without any thought as to why Atkinson was putting this to people all over the world through the medium of the BBC. Atkinson leaned back, his face impassive as the heat of the argument reached its climax. Joy, he finally said, the softer tone of his voice making the words more impactful, I'm beginning to realize that none of this is actually about me or my career or any of my characters as I intended them. You have predetermined that my characters are somehow inherently inept regardless of whether you even spent time analyzing what we do. But I'll tell you what's fascinating to me. When is the last time you created anything that actually gave enjoyment to any number of millions of people? The question, thrown like a challenge across the room, hung heavy in the air. Joy's cheeks blazed scarlet, and for the first time in what felt like hours, she looked utterly and unequivocally lost for words. That brief spell of silence wasn't to last, though. Excuse me, Joy finally snapped back, and the tension at the table ratcheted up several more notches, ready to explode into even greater heights. Joy's voice was instantly edged with aggression, the one tone that told him he was really offending her. Are you questioning my credibility, Rowan Atkinson? I've been in this business for decades, and I've got the books and stand-up acts and television shows to prove it, longer than a lot of your fans have been alive, probably. His eyebrows went up a millimeter, a signal that those familiar with his style recognize as a red flag for something perfectly aimed and perfectly executed. I'm not questioning your experience, Joy Atkinson said dryly. I'm asking about creation, about what you make. What you bring into the world as new, and as joyful, and as good. There's a difference between occupying space and actually giving it meaning. He could feel the room tense up around him and cast a hurried glance toward the other hosts. Whoopi tried to steer the conversation back into safer waters, turning to him. Rowan, maybe we could talk about some of your new projects. Joy wasn't ready to be done yet, however. Apparently her pride had been pricked and she intended to push back. Oh, I see, she huffed, the disdain evident in her voice. The great big condescending British arrogance. You think there is a more important kind of television out there, because it comes from the motherland. That kind of elitist bullshit won't work with me, Mr. Bean. The laughter stopped when Atkinson repeated the name, adding in a surprisingly calm tone, Mr. Bean. And by the way he used the name, he turned a dismissive gesture into an intellectual sword. You keep referring to this character like you're supposed to be somehow insulting me by invoking him. Do you have any idea how many hundreds of countries and languages Mr. Bean has brought laughter into? He connects on a level that few other pieces of art can achieve. Please, Joy exclaimed with a sneer, unable to take any more condescension. He hardly speaks. A mime could do the exact same thing. He let a look of surprise cross his features, and then his voice dropped, the quietness giving it force. Could they? If it really is that simple, Joy, why isn't there a long line of incredibly funny, world-renowned, globally recognized mime artists? A faint twitch disturbed his smile. Physical comedy, unlike the things that seem so to you to be mere superficialities in what he does, comes from an extremely profound and sophisticated understanding of human behavior and experience. It's that ability to express what are essentially complex emotions and ideas simply by means of the body, and that can be enormously meaningful and joyfulness for an audience. How come nobody knows that these things can give life purpose? But what meaning is there? Joy blared in response to him. I defy you to show me any meaning in a middle-aged man getting his face stuck inside a turkey. There were gasps of outrage from some in the audience who understood immediately the reference to Mr. Bean's most iconic humiliating scene. His expression became unnervingly blank as he finally spoke. The meaning, Atkinson stated with perfect calm, is that it's silly, it's ridiculous. We've all had experiences in life of that sort. You've said over the years, I don't get it. I find no meaning in certain types of humor or popular forms of expression. Where is the inherent meaning? Where is the truth, Rowan? And so on and on and on. Well, you don't need a PhD to see the depth of emotion in Mr. Bean, do you? Rowan, Joy quipped sarcastically. It was a very profound piece of performance, Atkinson agreed dryly. The profundity is that it is accessible to almost everybody on Earth. That's because he doesn't communicate much more than our most primitive instincts, primal urges to survive and fulfill our biological needs, as demonstrated by his near-permanent state of hunger, Joy countered. He finally smiled faintly and admitted to one slight misstatement. Well, that's a slight exaggeration of that particular character's motivation, but let's be frank, his primary motivation throughout his series is almost always some selfish little goal or desire, and it is this self-indulgence that gets him in more often than not. But let's try and find a more uplifting reason for why he succeeds universally in his so-called endeavors. The underlying reason, as I am sure most discerning individuals see, is the innate desire that we all feel, some consciously and some less so, that somewhere out there in existence it would be extremely gratifying to achieve some totally selfless act even once, something or other which demonstrates a level of profound compassion or integrity. Then with chillingly measured clarity he added, your inability to see that in him just confirms what I suspected all along. You have nothing to teach people about true meaning. Your entire approach is surface level. You judge without understanding. I mean that, Atkinson stated without the slight inclination of a smile on his usually smooth face. Joy's jaw dropped slightly as if she didn't know how to quite articulate in response. You dare, she asked, incredulously, voice shaking with fury. You dare to sit on my program and insult my intelligence. I've interviewed presidents, I've reported on the biggest global events, she. You've done plenty of things, Atkinson cut in before she'd barely begun, a confidence oozing from him that was almost unnatural. But with all of that extensive background, after all of those interviews, and of all of those global events that you've encountered, one cannot help but to question if those experiences were prepared for with the level of rigor you've brought into this conversation this morning. Because if this interaction is indicative of your general standards of journalism, I'm starting to understand why American television has received such negative reviews and reception abroad. What is that even supposed to mean? What negative reception? Joy asked, hotly, face flush, as she took a step away from the table. Atkinson smiled with no heat behind it this time. That was the expression of a person who had all of the answers. Well, Joy, there's a commonly perceived consensus beyond American borders, particularly among the entertainment press abroad, that daytime talk shows in the United States prioritize a certain level of dramatization for shock value and topical content rather than anything of significant value, that they prefer to trade nuance for more voluminous but superficial discussion and to emphasize so-called viral moments to genuine discourse and thoughtfully produced content for public consumption or enjoyment. I confess that for my own sake as a professional observer and a consumer of entertainment, I have always dismissed that stereotype as unfair. Having witnessed this interview this morning, however, I must conclude that perhaps there is more credence to that belief than I previously and hopefully imagined. You pretentious arrogance! Joy burst out, making ready to rise in fury. Joy, Whoopi said, cutting in firmly as she reached for Joy's arm to stop her motion. Perhaps we all take a breath, okay? No. Joy flung back, snapping Whoopi's hand away as she got out of her chair. I'm not going to sit here and listen to this pompous British snob insult my professionalism. Oh, my show, my country. Through the all-commotion, Atkinson maintained a remarkable state of equipoise, leaning back to regard the scene before him as if he were on a faraway stage observing a puppet show. I haven't insulted your country, Joy, Atkinson stated, calm and even to an unnerving degree. I'm simply made some comments about the perceived standards of your television format. And I'm saying to you that your critique of my work demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding about what my work aims to and achieve. If you find that assessment to be offensive, perhaps the problem lies within the assessment or not the comments themselves. The problem is that you believe yourself to be superior to every one of us. You believe that since you're a more refined Englishman that you are better than those of us crude and loud Americans. Atkinson didn't so much as flinch. Actually, I believe good theater is good theater regardless of where it's produced, and I firmly believe entertaining content can be produced in any part of the world. However, I also do believe, quite rightly so, that criticism should ideally be informed, and that an interview can only truly be constructive if the interlocutor at least has some basic understanding of what their subject's work is about. And those aren't precisely very British standards, are they, Joy? The other hosts tried their best not to meet anyone's gaze. The live audience had fallen silent in a stunned hush, and it was clear that everyone was observing something much larger than just heated debate. "I can't sit here and be subjected to this," Joy finally declared as she grabbed her jacket. "This is my show, and I refuse to be schooled by a 20-year over-the-hill has-been comic who peaked in a character that could barely speak." Suddenly Atkinson looked. He didn't snarl, he didn't shout. He merely looked, and what that cold, pure disappointment imparted to the studio room was worse than any rage could ever do. Atkinson rose slowly from his seat. "Has been," he murmured again, and then all of the studio staff and all of those watching on live feed knew they couldn't go back, not from this. Joy, Mr. Bean's Christmas special was shown just last month. It set new records for ratings in 3 continents. My live shows sell out within minutes. But if even that was not true, if I was the has-been you seem so determined to cast me as, it would not change what has occurred here tonight. For 15 minutes you have made quite a commendable effort to avoid engaging with any thought or concept that departs from the ones already firmly rooted in your own mind. I had come looking for a conversation, Joy. Instead, I encountered a performance, and if I may say so, one not of the highest standard." That last comment must have hit Joy like a shot. Her face flared from a light shade of pink to an almost violent shade of red as the other hosts on stage sat with wide eyes and open mouths, their feet rooted to the floor, as they contemplated whether the whole segment would end or if it was about to enter a fully spectacular collapse. 20 minutes you have spent illustrating with incredible precision the very reason intelligent dialogue has all but died out in American broadcasting. You came here with your opinion predetermined, with your pre-written questions, with your agenda in place. You were not interested in any understanding of my work, my creative process, or my perspective. You were interested in what, and indeed who, you saw as a suitable target, and you perceived me as an easy victim. Joy was already moving her mouth to formulate some venomous response, but Atkinson raised one hand, in action so simple, yet surprisingly commanding, that she faltered. "But what you failed to comprehend, Joy, is why the character of Mr. Bean has remained such a potent force over 3 decades. Not because it is simple, but because it is honest. The character engages with the world with a sense of wide-eyed curiosity. He proceeds with an enduring sense of optimism, and when he encounters obstacles, he picks himself up and he carries on trying rather than instinctively reaching out with outrage and denigration." The room plunged into an even deeper silence, so quiet in fact one could hear Joy's breath catching in the stillness. The flush on her face receded from red to a ghostly shade of pale. On the other faces there were varied expressions of bewildered surprise. "Well, wait just 1 minute," Joy began breathlessly, but the Atkinson stopped her immediately with another hand gesture and a softly stated "No, Joy. Not really, because you've had your minutes. You've had a number of them, in fact, and I think you have utilized most of them effectively, proving to a considerable extent my initial observation of the gulf between knowing how to speak and actually having something of consequence to say. The tragedy here is not incidentally that you happen to dislike my work. We're all entitled to opinions, of course, regardless of how informed they may be. The tragedy is that you squandered an extraordinary opportunity to have a productive discourse with an individual whose experiences and whose work, and who actually has something to communicate regarding Thornmans, what he's done and how he's gone about it, and instead chose to turn this whole encounter into a kind of coliseum. Finally, Whoopi intervened. "Rowan, I think that we may have all gotten a little heated and maybe now we should—" "No," Whoopi Atkinson interrupted, the look of genuine disappointment written all over his face as he turned to her. "This isn't about people getting heated. This is about a question of professionalism, of basic respect." Joy didn't just get emotional, she took it personally. She insulted my work and the intelligence of millions of people who connect with it. She dismissed decades of creative endeavor as lazy stereotypes, and then apparently felt it within her power to dismiss the subject of it as being an example of higher quality discussion based on her own inability to get past the concept. He turned back toward Joy now with no sign of flinching as his stare bore into her like a laser. "You've called me a has-been, Joy. You've suggested I peak more than 20 years ago. Can I ask you a simple question? When was the last time you ever put together a piece of work that brought people together rather than pushed people apart? Can I ask you a question? When did you ever write something with a smile on people's faces rather than leaving them with rage? When did you last use the power that you wield in your position to build things up rather than tear down other people? She opened her mouth then and it snapped shut again. The woman who just 10 seconds ago fired off response after response seemed to utterly be at a loss for words now. Just when the moment could get no more agonizing, the next statement from Atkinson only pushed everything to the next level. You know the biggest difference between British comedy and American comedy? Do you know what that is? It's not culture, it's not sophistication, and it's certainly not whatever cultural stereotypes you like to parade. It's a matter of British comedy willing to punch upwards, to poke the king, and American comedy being too damn willing to punch downwards at anyone who dares to be different, or vulnerable, or genuine. And with that today you are the perfect example. The room was so tense, the air was so thick it could barely breathe when Sarah Haynes tried one more time. Can we perhaps shift our focus to charity work, Rowan? I know that you have a lot in common with a lot of organizations in. Thank you, Sarah, but I do believe we are well past the point of salvageability for this conversation. Inasmuch as Joy seems utterly unwilling to engage in honest dialogue, and inasmuch as I have no desire to offer any more material for what has clearly descended, Atkinson said, as he reached to retrieve his suit jacket from behind him. But suddenly, out of seemingly nowhere, Joy found her voice naturally with more anger. You can't leave. This is live TV. You've got a commitment. Atkinson paused the act of putting on his suit coat and turned back slowly, his expression softening for the first time toward her, in the form of a profound and deep sort of disappointment. Joy, my commitment was to do an interview. It was not my commitment to be a sacrificial goat on the altar of your own insecurities. There is a difference between asking hard questions and asking personal attacking questions, and there is a difference between professional skepticism and frankly just refusal to comprehend the subject that you're discussing, all of which you decided to cross into 15 minutes ago and haven't looked back since. This is absurd. You are throwing an absolute toddler tantrum. We interview people. That's how interviews work in the real world. Atkinson, still wearing his new coat, walked to the other direction and turned once towards Joy. Joy, the difference between being a punchline for me or just a bit character like this one for you is as important to me as it probably is for anyone else. What came next was to determine how the next 3 minutes of live television would proceed, but for all in the studio, it certainly wouldn't be pretty. No, Joy. In the real world, interviewers do their homework. They learn about the people they have sitting in front of them. They can ask them informed questions based on facts, and not their assumptions, prejudices, and stereotypes which you're so desperate to embrace. I mean, honestly, what we just witnessed there today isn't journalism. It isn't entertainment. It sure as hell isn't professional in any sense of the word. It's just pathetic. Atkinson then looked to the other hosts for a moment, and for the first time that felt like an entire lifetime, a hint of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Whoopee, Sarah. I am truly sorry that you both had to witness that. Both of you at least attempted to make a concerted effort to maintain some semblance of decorum, but unfortunately one individual's desperate and calculated attempts to manufacturing controversy has polluted this entire discourse. Suddenly Joy jumped to her feet once again, setting her chair rolling precariously backward. Don't you ever apologize to me for that. I don't need your pity, nor do I need your condescending, disingenuous platitudes. If you can't stomach a difficult interview, then I suggest you stick to making children's television. At that point, this should have been game over. This was supposed to be the knockout blow, the one question that would finally utterly unnerve him and send him scrambling from the table in a fit of sputtered outrage. Instead, something remarkable happened. Rowan Atkinson cracked a smile. For the first time, truly the first time, there wasn't a shred of sarcasm or feigned amusement in his eyes, just plain contentment. You know what, Joy? That is actually the absolutely perfect note upon which to end this whole unfortunate proceeding. And yes, occasionally I do make children's television. I do, and I do that. Why? Because children respond to and value honesty, authenticity, creativity. They understand raw emotion and a sense of genuineness, qualities that seem to be rapidly diminishing in this room. They are too intelligent to tolerate artificial rage and contrived conflict masquerading as enlightenment. Children understand what so many adults seemingly forget, that entertainment at its very core should serve to delight. Rowan began to gather his things as though to leave the table, and for a fleeting moment the camera caught a glimpse of him leaning down as he turned back toward Joy for the final time. And perhaps he mused, his smile lingering, perhaps the world may have been a little less preposterous if more of us approached life and one another with the pure, unadulterated wonder and open-heartedness of a child. As though what a particular Mr. Bean has demonstrated perhaps there are in this modern world a desperately needed need for childlike courage, resilience, and wonder. Joy rose to her feet once again, practically trembling with barely suppressed fury. Then leave. Go back to England or wherever else it is and let people there appreciate your beloved Mr. Bean. We don't need you. But Atkinson's smile was one you could only consider as sheer placidity. Joy, that's the remarkable brilliance of truly wonderful comedy, great art, and a thoroughly delightful piece of entertainment. It doesn't concern itself one whit with whether you, of course, Atkinson tilted his head slightly, a devilish sparkle in his eye, feel you may need it. That beautiful entertainment, glorious art, is readily available to those capable of embracing their wonder and openness as adults of spirit and substance at the table. Alas, you seem to have proved today those particular virtues seem somewhat in short supply at this particular table. Rowan Atkinson just walked right off of the table, leaving the View hosts dumbfounded along with all of the View audience there, with a fury-filled Joy Behar left sputtering into the microphone. The camera kept rolling as Joy attempts to regain control, and after less than 30 minutes a planned light-hearty funny segment has descended into utter disarray and TV anarchy of the highest caliber. One that revealed the violent aftermath of bad interview questions, personal attacks, and conversation that simply lost its